With gold reaching $1,000 an ounce, we are asking the question whether there are any hard currencies left. The purists may say that there have never been hard currencies since countries went off the gold standard, but we'd like to take a pragmatic approach and look at the relative value of different currencies. Ultimately, even gold bucks are unlikely to have all their net worth in gold, if for no other reason that it's impractical. But where do you put your money? Do you put it in the dollar, in the euro, into the Chinese yuan, Australian dollar? Today we'll focus on the dollar and the euro, and we'll follow up with an analysis of other areas. In the US, our biggest fear is that there may not be an exit strategy to the various policies that are being pursued. Money is printed to bail out just about anybody. We have very easy money from the Federal Reserve, and in addition to that we have the so-called stimulus package. Without going into the details of the merits of these, what we're concerned about is that at some point some of that money is going to stick. But unless we allow a deleveraging of the consumer, unless we encourage consumers to save more in the long run, we are simply going to go back to where we are right now, meaning that as the stimulus is withdrawn, as monetary policy has to fight inflation that's put into the system, that will plunge right back down. And as a result, we're concerned about very long-term inflation. On top of that, the Federal Reserve seems to have an interest in having the dollar go down. The Federal Reserve wants the price level go up so that people who hold mortgages are no longer upside down, so that the relative prices of homes isn't as high anymore. To do that, for example, to buy the agency securities, it intentionally overprices these securities so they're less attractive to the traditional buyers that include foreigners. And so as a result, we believe the dollar may be under threat from that. Let's talk about the euro a little bit, because everybody loves to hate the euro right now. The euro is vulnerable these days because European financial institutions have this dramatic exposure to toxic assets that are primarily originating in the US. And note that, by the way, one of the reasons why the dollar rallied in 2008 is because European financial institutions, in their distrust for the dollar, had put hedges in place to their toxic security purchases. But now, as these toxic securities have been decimated in values, they had to buy dollars to reduce their exposure with their positions. One reason why we are more comfortable with the euro than many others is because the European Central Bank, under the leadership of Trichet, has never pursued the policies that were pursued in the US or in Asia. Specifically, the European Central Bank has always had a tighter leash, has always been concerned about money supply. Trichet is the one central banker that is still talking about money supply from time to time, whereas everybody else has pretty much found that out together with a lot of academic studies that say that the only thing you need to focus on is long-term inflation expectations. We do believe money supply in certain instances do have a major role to play, and the environment we're to see in the coming years may be proof of that. Trichet and the European Central Bank have made a conscious decision that they rather have a severe recession or a depression than to pursue the inflationary policies the US is pursuing. And to illustrate that, it's not just on the monetary side, let's think about the fiscal side. European governments were faster than the US in guaranteeing the banking system. But when it comes to spending the money, we believe the US will be, quote-unquote, more efficient than Europe, meaning that in the US it's simple to pass an $800 billion stimulus package. It won't be that easy in Europe, with all the different governments having different priorities. The Achilles heel in Europe, though, is the banking system. In Europe, when a bank needs to be bailed out, it has to come from the budget of a member state or even a regional authority. In the US, it's much easier to print the money to that. And that is a much more challenging approach. As a result, in Europe, it's been preferred to have this ring-fence approach where the bank debt is guaranteed rather than actually money being injected. Another threat in the Eurozone is the exposure to Eastern Europe. First, there was a capital flight over to Western Europe, also to the US, because of the guarantees in the banking system. And now Europe has to pay the price for it. Many European banks, especially Austrian banks, have invested heavily in Eastern Europe, bought banks there. However, on the flip side, consumers in Eastern Europe love to get access to low-interest mortgages, so people would buy homes and get a Swiss franc mortgage on it. Now, as capital is fleeing out of the countries in Eastern Europe, these mortgages become untenable. They're way too expensive because the value of these mortgages is just in no proportion to the value of the underlying asset anymore, with the currencies coming down and the mortgages still being in Swiss franc or in euro. What we believe will happen is that European governments will ultimately bail out Eastern Europe. That's not so much a judgment call whether that should happen or not, just that it's cheaper for Europe to bail out Eastern Europe, because much of Western Europeans' industry is geared as building the infrastructure in Eastern Europe. Very different, by the way, from what may happen in China, where it is far easier for the Chinese to prop up their domestic economy than to try to bail out the American consumer. More on currencies in an upcoming clip here, and for now this is our take on the US dollar and the euro.